others. So
I don't know if that's a nervous laugh, but it makes me a little bit nervous. And that's why I wanted to bring in Dr. Raywat Deonandan, epidemiologist, associate professor of health sciences at the University of Ottawa. Dr. Deonandan, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
I'd like to think you share her optimism when it comes to lifting restrictions, but there is the elephant in the room when we talk about the variants. How concerned should we be about the variants that have been showing up in the country over the last number of weeks?
It's a real threat, and I liken this to a movie, because it is very much like a movie, an action movie. We're in the third act. And in the third act, the biggest foe is fought. It's the darkest before the dawn, all that great stuff. So we have one last great battle to fight, and that is against the threat of these new variants. And they'll keep on coming so long as we have transmission happening at a high rate around the world. So we have to vaccinate ahead of that likelihood.
And so the positive then is when we hear Anita Anand, procurement minister, saying we're getting hundreds of thousands of the vaccines, the doses in the next week. We're up into the millions by the end of the month, at the end of next month. So that's got to be positive then with getting ahead of this.
It's very positive. Now, it matters which formulations we're getting, and it matters how quickly we get them, because right now the mRNA formulations work well against all variants that we know about. New ones will come out eventually that we call them escape variants that elude the power of the vaccines. And some of the other vaccines don't do that well against the South African variant, the Brazilian variant. New ones will arise that the vaccines don't work against. So it's important to get whatever immunity we can against the current variants before new ones arise. That gives us time to create boosters against new versions. So we should probably expect to get booster shots sometime next year to protect us against any new variants that will emerge.
Go over the variants, because I've heard of the three, and just recap what we're seeing right now.
There are more than three out there, but the three main ones. We have the UK, the B.1.1.7. It is a lot more transmissible, probably more lethal. That's unclear. We have the South African variant, B.1.351, which is a little more transmissible, possibly more lethal, but also eludes the immune system better. And P1, the Brazilian variant, which does all those things and possibly evades vaccines more so. We have the California variant. We have other variants popping up all over the world. There are about 16 that I've heard of. And they'll keep on popping up. But it's the ones that are more transmissible and more lethal that we're concerned about, as they are more likely to become dominant. So right now in Canada, it's the UK B.1.1.7 that is our major concern, and to a lesser extent, B.1.351, the South African one.
And you're saying right now, though, with Pfizer and Moderna, it seems the efficacy of those vaccines against these variants is high?
That is correct. Keep in mind, too, that mRNA vaccines, we can create a new one in 48 hours. So imagine a new variant emerges that is resistant to our current vaccines. We sequence that, and 48 hours later, we have a new vaccine. Then it takes about 6 weeks to get the factories retasked to produce those things. So the mRNA vaccines are our best weapon in this arms race against the virus. So that's why it's important, I think, to get a shot into everyone's arm as quickly as we can of whatever vaccine, and then use the mRNA technology to give us boosters in coming years when we have that up and running manufacturing scale.
And that's really encouraging then when you do hear about how quickly they're able to turn around, and when they identify what the variant is, they'll tweak the vaccine so we can still be protected.
Oh, yeah. The mRNA technology is a game changer, not just for this disease, but possibly for Ebola and HIV and cancer. It really is a whole new brave world of vaccination. But it is a brand new technology. It requires special kinds of technology, special reagents, special factories, special workers. So not everyone can make them. And it might just be the domain of rich countries. So I'm a little concerned that going forward, this kind of vaccine might only be available to a handful of countries. And we have to combat this at the global level. So all kinds of equity and distribution issues are built into this problem.
I've got a question here. If you've had SARS in the past, will those antibodies help with COVID-19? We talked with another researcher in the last half hour, and this whole idea of antibodies, whether I've had COVID or this person asking about SARS, because this is a similar virus then. What would your response to that be?
It's an interesting question. We call that cross immunity. And it has been observed in other kinds of infections before. And some people say that the cross-immunity to other coronaviruses, like even the common cold, might be responsible for some of the declining rates we see around the world. I don't know what the answer is. I'd be surprised, frankly, if that's the case. But SARS really didn't infect a lot of people. So even if it were true, it's not really a large number of people we're talking about.
The whole idea of Dr. Tam saying, yes, things are positive, but we still have to be vigilant. The fact that we already are pretty good at wearing our masks, social distancing, is that not a great protection even on these variants?
It's not. And we've observed in the UK that B117 had exponential growth even during lockdown. That's a very important observation. It says that the existing mitigation efforts might not be enough to stop the spread of B117 and the other variants. So it's really important that we slow transmission as much as we can to avoid allowing B117 to be the dominant variant, as it will become eventually, but we can slow that process, to buy us time to vaccinate. This is a race here. We're racing the eventual dominance of this variant by getting shots into as many arms as we can, which is why many people, myself among them, are advocating for a slower reopening process.
Yeah, and when I was going to say, if you're saying slower process, you're talking about the reopening of the economy, because next week, Albertans are waiting to see if we're going to go into step 2 of our reopening. From your research background, you're saying be careful.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of that. I understand their economic considerations, their mental health considerations, all that is real. But if we're looking at this strictly from a public health perspective, it does not seem wise to give the virus a head start when we can get out of this year. I mean, we're past the midpoint of the pandemic. We're in the final stages here. But we can extend that suffering if we open up too soon.
Because then there's the concern that, sure, we're seeing hospitalization rates go down. I mean, in Alberta, we're seeing active case numbers go down. The concern is what could happen with the variants.
Yeah, so will there be a third wave or resurgence? I think there will be for a number of reasons, but this time the new variants might be the mechanism of that third wave. Now, we might just see an increase in cases, but not hospitalizations and deaths if we can get the right people vaccinated in the right numbers. So that's a big if. So if that's the case, then great. Let there be cases, but no one's going to die. I'd rather see no cases at all, though. So, but again, if we slow the opening process, then we prevent the new variants from being dominant faster. So we slow them down.
You know, I mean, every province has to determine the priority when it comes to vaccinations. And I know in Alberta there's a lot of frontline workers, different critical workers saying, how come I'm not getting a vaccination before someone else? Is that the real tough decision policymakers have? Because at the beginning, it's pretty straightforward. Let's focus on long-term care facilities. Let's focus on the staff who work in those to make sure they're vaccinated. It seems like, okay, where does the rollout go from there? Is that a challenge, whether it be in Alberta or Ontario?
It is the fundamental challenge because it speaks to the fundamental value and the question of what it is we are trying to accomplish. Are we trying to simply keep the healthcare system running? Are we trying to prevent the overload of the ICUs? Or are we trying to stop transmission in its wake? So everyone agrees that we have to do this by risk, but there are different ways of considering risk. There's a risk of death, there's a risk of infection, and a risk of exposure. The long-term care residents are at high risk of death. The physicians and nurses are at high risk of infection. Teachers and bus drivers and priests are at high risk of exposure. Depends on how you want to think about this. There's an argument, and I adhere to this argument, that maybe you get your biggest bang for your buck by just doing it by age. You focus on the over 80s, and the over 70s, and the over 60s, and stratify down that way. That way you just build in immunity into the population and prevent the hospitals from being overloaded. But there's no right answer here. The only wrong answer is to do it by first come, first serve. That is untenable.
Good stuff. Raywat, thanks as always.